Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone, and a virtual welcome to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in Toronto. My name is Deanna Horton, and I am a senior fellow here at the Munk School. I have just finished working on a chapter in an upcoming book about the Indo-Pacific, so I was very motivated to be involved with this panel. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. This is for the University of Toronto, but I would like to say that there will be people on this panel who are from other parts of North America, and I think we all need to acknowledge the elders and the knowledge and the lands that they have occupied before and that we are now sitting on and from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this webinar, the Consulate General of Japan in Toronto and the University of British Columbia Center for Japanese Research, which is most ably represented this evening by Dr. Yves Tiberghien. And thank you as well to the Center for the Study of Global Japan for hosting, and to the excellent staff at Munk for organizing us. Here's how we are going to proceed. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the topic and to the speakers. Each will begin by giving some initial comments, followed by a discussion among the panelists. Then we will take questions from you. Please use the Q&A function on your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. After what I hope will be a thoughtful and compelling discussion, Consul General Sasayama has kindly agreed to give the final comments. So let's get everybody on the screen now. And I'm just going to talk a bit about the Indo-Pacific. It's a critical region, over half the world's population, almost 2/3 of the global GDP. We first started to hear this characterization, Indo-Pacific, from Japan, which talked about a vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, emphasizing principles such as the rule of law, quality infrastructure, investment, and maritime stability. Why the term Indo-Pacific as opposed to Asia-Pacific? First, emphasized the inclusion of India and the Indian Ocean. Second, it was seen as a way to counter China's growing influence in Asia. Other countries began to follow Japan's lead, in particular the United States, where it was eagerly adopted, and soon free and open Indo-Pacific, known as FOIP, became a common theme in the Washington think tank world. The EU announced a strategy in September 2021, which emphasized sustainable and inclusive prosperity and the transition to a green economy. The Biden administration has given notice of its Indo-Pacific economic framework, and we now have a new acronym, IPEF, which is meant to focus on fair and resilient trade, supply chain resilience, infrastructure, clean energy, plus tax and anti-corruption. Canada is working on its own version, an Indo-Pacific strategy to diversify trade and investment, strengthen security cooperation, and boost international assistance. And then there are the countries sitting in the middle of all these strategies, including India and Southeast Asia. Before I go any further, though, we who work in the international relations field are profoundly affected by the war in Ukraine. So before we begin the discussion, I just wanted to say, express on behalf of the panel our sympathy and offer our support for the Ukrainian people. So our panel today is going to be looking at all of these various strategies on Indo-Pacific. How should we understand them? How will they change foreign policy, especially in light of the war in Ukraine? There are many common elements, but how do they differ? And how will they fit into or change the dynamics of the existing institutional architecture of Asia and beyond? We have a stellar lineup of experts. I'm going to introduce them very briefly in the order in which they will be speaking. You can find their bios on the website. First, Dr. Akiko Fukushima, Senior Fellow at the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research, educated at Osaka University, Johns Hopkins SAIS, with a career at Aoyama Gakuin University and the National Institute for Research Advancement, and serving in an advisory capacity to the Hague Journal of Diplomacy and on the Advisory Council on National Security and Defense Capabilities to the Prime Minister of Japan. Dr. Fukushima's publications include most recently from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific, its motives, aims, and future. Next, Dr. Christy Govella, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, specializing in the international relations of the Indo-Pacific region. Prior to joining GMF, Dr. Govella was affiliated with the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Harvard University, and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. She has published in academic journals and edited volumes, is the co-editor of 2 books, and also serves as an adjunct fellow with the East-West Center and Pacific Forum, and co-editor of the journal Asia Policy. Next, Nicolas Véron is a co-founder of the Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, and is also with the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. A graduate of France's École Polytechnique and École des Mines, Monsieur Véron served in both government and private sector in France and is now also an independent board member of the Global Derivatives Trade Repository arm of DTCC, a nonprofit financial infrastructure company. In September 2012, Bloomberg Markets included Véron in its yearly global 50 most influential list with reference to his early advocacy of European Banking Union. Jonathan Freed is a senior advisor with Bennett Jones, LLP in Ottawa, the Albright Stonebridge Group in Washington, D.C., senior associate to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also in Washington, and advisor to Llewellyn Consulting in London, UK, and is also a distinguished fellow of the Asia-Pacific Foundation, among many other roles. In his previous Government of Canada career, he was coordinator for international economic relations, personal representative of the G20 from 2017 to 2020, ambassador to the WTO, ambassador to Japan, and many other senior positions. Mr. Freed received his BA and LLB from the University of Toronto and LLM from Columbia University. Dr. Yves Tiberghien is a professor of political science and Konwakai Chair in Japanese research at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where he's also Director Emeritus of the Institute of Asian Research and Director of the Center for Japanese Research. He received his PhD from Stanford University, and apart from his work at UBC, is a regular visiting professor at Tokyo University and at Sciences Po Paris. He has many publications, but is now working on 2 books, Up for Grabs, Disruption, Competition, and the Remaking of the Global Economic Order, and Navigating the Age of Disruption, Understanding Canada's Options in the Shifting Global Order. And you will find more information on all of our panelists on the website. Next, finally, Consul General of Japan, Sasayama Takuya, he will be at the end of the program. He's a career diplomat who has served in Mexico, Malaysia, Korea, the United States, and Canada. He was also director of the APEC division and the first Southeast Asia division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Sasayama graduated from the University of Tokyo. He took up his current position as Consul General in Toronto in July 2020. So I'm going to turn it over now to our first panelist, Akiko Fukushima. Let's begin with the view from Tokyo under Prime Minister Kishida.
Thank you, Diana, for your kind invitation to join this discussion today. As per requested in my initial remark, I would like to reflect on Japan's initiative on free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, its evolution and its relevance in today's international politics, particularly in the context of the Russian aggression to Ukraine. I'm afraid this will make 2022 a watershed year in history. Japan's launch of free and open Indo-Pacific dates to 2007, when former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo spoke at the Indian Parliament, stressing the confluence of Indian and Pacific Oceans. He emphasized the need to develop network for free flow of people, goods, capital, and knowledge in the broader region of Indo-Pacific. Subsequently, in 2012, Prime Minister Abe contributed an article entitled Asia's Democratic Security Diamond to Project Syndicate. These two ideas were integrated into Japan's FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, which was announced in August 2016. In the background, Japan saw the Indo-Pacific thriving with half of the world population living, but faced with multiple threats. Although some observers wondered whether this vision would survive beyond changes over prime ministers. However, successive prime ministers have inherited the vision. Prime Minister Suga, in his policy speech to the Diet in January 2021, stated that establishing a free and open order based on the rule of law is extremely important in the Indo-Pacific region, which is the hub of the dynamism of the world. Prime Minister Kishida made his policy to continue the free and open Indo-Pacific vision in his first press conference immediately after his election last fall. In his policy speech to the Diet in January 2022, Prime Minister Kishida said that this is a year that will test how astute Japanese diplomacy can be. He said he will pursue realism diplomacy for a new era and will advance free and open Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Kishida visited India over the weekend and agreed to strengthen the partnership to enhance a free and open Indo-Pacific underpinned by the inclusiveness and rules-based order. He also visited Cambodia over the weekend, which is the chair of ASEAN this year, and concurred to cooperate, including the Indo-Pacific. Why did the vision be sustained this way? In my personal view, it is because the free and open Indo-Pacific is a regional vision essential for Japan's security and prosperity. It is also because this is the first regional vision Japan has led proactively rather than leading from behind, and has been successful in putting other countries on board, as was mentioned by Diana at the outset. Adjectives have significance, as free includes freedom of navigation in the region, and open includes universal values such as freedom and democracy in the region. Since the launch, Japan's FOIP has evolved from the initial noun of strategy to the vision in summer 2018, mindful of the criticisms that it is a containment strategy to China. Japan identifies its FOIP as inclusive. Diplomatic Blue Book 2020 clearly describes that no country is excluded from partnership. Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific is open to countries who share the vision. Meanwhile, the elements included in the FOIP have been consistent and have been further elaborated. In short, Japan embraces three pillars, namely, one, promotion of universal principles such as rule of law, freedom of navigation, and free trade. Second, pursuit of economic prosperity. Third, commitment to peace and stability. Now, would the FOIP survive beyond the Russian invasion to Ukraine? Prime Minister Kishida has swiftly condemned the Russian President Putin for his aggression to Ukraine by saying that it is an attempt against international law to unilaterally change the status quo by force, which shakes the foundation of international order. The Kishida government has announced a set of economic sanctions against Russia, aligning closely with the G7 countries. Japan has also announced its readiness to accept refugees from Ukraine. International experts have observed that the Japanese responses are more coordinated with G7 than in the case of 2014. I hasten to add that this was and is a tough decision for Japan, because Russia is our neighbor, because Japan relies on imports from Russia. Above all, because we still have unresolved territorial issue of Northern Ireland and a pending bilateral Russo-Japan peace treaty over 7 decades. This morning, that is earlier today in your time, Russia has told Japan that they will suspend peace treaty negotiations because of the unfriendly actions taken by the Japanese government. The reaction of other countries in the Indo-Pacific have varied. 7 member states of ASEAN voted for the UN Emergency Sessions resolution, while Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos abstained. India also abstained. On the other hand, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand have introduced economic sanctions along with Europe and the US. In the Indo-Pacific, there is a growing sense that what is happening in Europe will have a strong bearing to the Indo-Pacific, and thus we should raise voice to urge immediate halt of the violence. Over the weekend, Prime Minister Kishida visited India and Cambodia and agreed that we cannot tolerate any action to change the status quo by force. They have their respective situations and did not name a particular country to condemn their act, but they have agreed that they are against these actions taken and the impact on the people of Ukraine. Also, I would like to note that, as Diana said, the Biden administration has announced its Indo-Pacific strategy, just as the events in Eastern Europe continue to degenerate. Secretary of State Blinken explained that the announcement of its Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as his attendance to the Quad meeting in Australia, and an attendance at Japan ROK US Trilateral Foreign Ministers meeting in Hawaii in February show US interest in working on both the Indo-Pacific and Trans-Pacific allies and partners. I think it is not a time to choose between transatlantic and trans-Pacific, but we have to work on both. How would China emerge out from the Russian invasion? The Russo-Chinese joint statement of February 4th, 2022 reveals a strategic proximity. Some even observe unlimited friendship between the two. Nevertheless, despite its support to Russia, China initially has been very cautious as reflected in their actions at the United Nations. I have observed that China is closely examining how Russia uses its military asset, how the international community reacts to the Russian aggression, how effective economic sanctions are, etc. We need to observe whether China will cross the threshold of providing lethal and non-lethal weapons to Russia in response to requests, as well as how they are going to act in terms of economic sanctions. Depending on the course of actions it takes, China's position in the Indo-Pacific will change in future. I'm sure Mr. Kim Jong-un of DPRK is closely watching how situations evolve in Eastern Europe, and that would affect his decisions of developing missiles and nuclear weapons. In concluding, despite divergence, I trust it is time for free and open Indo-Pacific visions of Canada, Japan, the United States, and Europe, or to converge along with ASEAN in facing the watershed in international politics. With that note, let me conclude my initial remark. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Akiko-san. And now I'm going to turn it over to Christy. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me today. So I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief to open and just focus on the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I'm happy to talk about the implications for Ukraine. I'm sure there are many questions that will arise. So as Deanna already previewed, previous administrations prior to the Trump administration spoke largely about the Asia Pacific. And just to give some context, one of the first indications of a shift in focus came in 2017 with President Trump's November speech at APEC when he talked about a vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which built on Japan's formulation, which we just heard about. So under the Trump administration, the US government published a set of documents setting out its Indo-Pacific policy. For example, the 2017 National Security Strategy discussed the Indo-Pacific. And then in 2019, there were 2 reports from the Department of Defense and the Department of State that both laid out Indo-Pacific policies in their respective areas. So, the Biden administration's policy, as was mentioned, was released on February 11th of this year, but really it builds on the foundation of those other documents and contains a lot of similar components and continuities, although the tone and some of the emphasis is a bit different. So I wanted to talk about the basic structure of the Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as a few of the concerns and critiques that have come up. When you hear the speakers speak tonight, you probably will hear a lot of similar themes. And in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US, the document itself actually acknowledges that it took inspiration from other countries in the region. It names Japan, Australia, South Korea, ASEAN, New Zealand, the UK, France, and the EU. So really, this document was put together, with these other visions in consideration. And it's an 18-page document. It consists of 5 objectives. The first is advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is a pretty large umbrella. It includes things like democratic institutions, free press, fiscal transparency, rule of law, technology standards, and many other things. Second, it aims to build connections within and beyond the region, explicitly mentioning, of course, the US's 5 regional treaty allies, as well as its leading partners. And it talks about wanting to strengthen ties to create a lattice work of strong and mutually reinforcing coalitions. So the idea being to connect these allies and partners, not only through the US in the traditional hub and spokes model, but across each other in a much more flexible and integrated way. It also speaks about the Quad, it reaffirms ASEAN centrality, and it explicitly mentions working with the EU and NATO as extra-regional partners. Third, the strategy talks about driving regional prosperity, and the primary component of this is the forthcoming Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which Deanna already spoke about. I'm happy to talk more details about that, but I perhaps will leave it for the Q&A. We already know some of the contents and the 4 pillars that have been mentioned, which are trade, supply chains, infrastructure and decarbonization, and tax and anti-corruption, but there are also some very big missing pieces that people would argue. The 4th objective of the strategy is to bolster Indo-Pacific security, and integrated deterrence is a large part of this, as well as, again, building this network of allies and partners to counter security threats. It also mentions North Korea, as well as civilian security challenges. And then the 5th aim is to build regional resilience to transnational threats, particularly climate change and health threats. So the plan continues, to talk about how they can implement this over the next 12 to 24 months. There is an action plan that it concludes with. So the regional reactions and domestic reactions have largely been that the plan expresses the right ideas. It embraces allies and partners in a very forthcoming way. It's very positively framed. But there are also a lot of critiques, mainly perhaps stemming from the fact that it's short on details in some areas. Now, of course, we are going to see the forthcoming national defense strategy and national security strategies, so many people are expecting that details will be fleshed out. But the economic policy, as I already mentioned, is definitely an open question for a lot of regional partners and allies. Because it's known that this is not going to contain market access, and that is something that regional countries are really interested in. And it's known also, for example, that the administration has no intention of joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So although the economic framework that they're putting forward does have a lot of important issues included, the omission of market access raises some questions about the commitment to the region and the nature of economic engagement and how much it really can drive prosperity, particularly as China and other countries are deepening their engagement with the region. So another critique that has come up is that the definition of integrated deterrence remains somewhat unclear, and its applicability to the Indo-Pacific region is also something that remains to be fleshed out. It's also true that Although the China challenge is used to frame the document, people have talked about the lack of details there too. Now, this can be explained in part because the administration intends this to be a very positive vision for the Indo-Pacific that is not all about China. But it's also because there is actually a separate China strategy within the administration that will not be released to the public, which contains a lot of those details. So I think it does connect to a broader issue of the fact that some people have noted that the US seems to have perhaps 3 strategies in Asia. It's China strategy, it's Indo-Pacific strategy, and then perhaps it's Korean Peninsula strategy, and that these 3 things are not always completely clearly integrated. So I think the final question that comes up is really, can the administration make good on all these very nice sounding words and promises? Because it really does contain a lot of the right elements, but then, will there really be the resources and the dedication to follow through? And of course, the current conflict in Ukraine is perhaps testing this, perhaps also demonstrating the importance of the Indo-Pacific strategy in different ways. I think there are reasons to think that everything that's happening in Ukraine won't necessarily shift the US focus, and that actually the reality will be much more complicated than that. And in some ways, it might deepen the administration's focus. But I think that already we have a very concrete test of this Indo-Pacific strategy and the administration's true commitment to it and its ability to implement it. So I'll just conclude for now with those opening remarks, and I look forward to a very lively discussion.
Thank you very much, Christy. Okay, Nicolas Veron, if you can put your camera back on and we can move over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm an economist by background. I'm not really an international relations person, so I'm here to learn and provide a European perspective. For that reason, I will try to keep my remarks even more succinct than what we just heard from Christy, and really put a number of highlights looking forward to our conversation later on. So European Union is almost intrinsically a very inward-looking jurisdiction. The EU is beset with incredibly complex coordination issues, and it's not a country, of course. It's a complex organization of, at this point, 27 member states. It's been very absorbed by its internal issues and is not comfortable with an international role. If you look at, for example, the Arab Spring, which was just on the EU's in the immediate neighborhood of the European Union, it varies across countries, but generally speaking, the European Union has not been very forceful in intervening and helping countries that met turmoil following the first revolutions in the North African and Middle Eastern region in early 2011. So that gives you a sense of the inward-looking character. And I think that translates even more so to the Indo-Pacific region. It's very far away. When you're in Brussels and discussing EU issues, it's a very everybody understands that it's a very important region, but it doesn't interfere very easily with the day-to-day workings of the European Union. Of course, some EU member states have interest in the Indo-Pacific, but since the departure of Britain, that's really essentially one member state, which is France, coincidentally the one I'm from. France, of course, has territories in the Indo-Pacific region. It has a long-standing tradition of engaging with that region, but even there, it's a bit of a secondary player. I think everybody will recognize that compared with the main players such as the US and, of course, Asian nations. So the EU was basically caught off guard by a number of developments relative to this region. For example, China started engaging with a number of EU member states and neighboring countries with the so-called 16+1 strategy, which started in 2012, mostly with countries in Central and Eastern Europe, some of them members of the European Union, some of them not. And frankly, that was a very unfriendly initiative vis-à-vis the European Union itself, if only because of its format, to which the European Union has not reacted very forcefully. The EU then has been taken off guard by the escalation of tensions between the US and China, principally from 2018, and that has taken the institutions, but also most of the member states, very much out of their comfort zone. So they have tried to adapt. There has been an acceleration of trying to take a stance on China in particular and other issues relative to the region. Famously, the European Commission published a paper on EU-China strategy in March 2019, famously or infamously, because this paper was published a bit in a rush, led to a lot of commentaries. This idea that China is a systemic rival as well as a partner in cooperation and a competitor. What I would say about this paper, which I guess many of you are familiar with, is that it's difficult to characterize as an agreed position of the European Union. It was done, as I said, in a rush by the president of the European Union and his team of advisors, with some consultation with some member states, mainly France and Germany, but in a very limited way. So in a way, it has created facts on the ground, especially in terms of perceptions, and its language, to a certain extent, has been replicated in other places, including by the Biden administration. But I think it should not give a sense of a clear, agreed strategic vision of the EU vis-a-vis China. And actually, one illustration of that was the fact that the EU, a year later or so, at the end of 2020, agreed on the comprehensive agreement on investment with China. Very much an acceleration of that negotiation at the end of 2020, prompted by Chinese initiative. But immediately afterwards was embroiled for good reasons, in sanctions to China on its violations of human rights and possible crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, and which, of course, led to the agreement not being ratified and with no prospect of being ratified anytime soon. And then we had the tussle with Lithuania more recently last year, where Lithuania, again, not very coordinated, but did a forceful endorsement of Taiwanese aspirations to being a country by naming its Taiwanese center as Taiwan and not Taipei, as most other EU countries do. And of course, the EU has rallied in support of Lithuania and has tried to mitigate the negative impact of Chinese retaliation against that. But I think it has also illustrated the lack of effective mechanisms for coordination on positions vis-a-vis China in the European Union. So I will probably stop there at setting the scene. One word, of course, about the war in Ukraine and the consequences of that. I think stating the obvious, two things. First, the Belt and Road Initiative is in many ways EU-centric. Its main, far from only, but its main component has been a Chinese vision for Eurasia. And even so, it has always been a bit of a fuzzy definition. There's always been this idea that the Belt and Road had as one of its main objectives to connect the western tip of Eurasia, which is very much the European Union, with the eastern tip, which is China. And therefore, if we end up with developments of the war in Ukraine in a situation where there is a cutback in economic relationships between the bloc of the I don't know, the free world, the pro-Ukraine countries, including Japan, the US, the European Union, the UK, and others, on the one hand, and China on the other, because China would be giving too much support to Russia to sustain such economic relations, that would have many consequences, of course, but one of which would be critically undermining the vision of the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think is something that Chinese policymakers have very much in mind. The other thing that I will mention in conclusion is that the EU has not followed the US in explicitly putting pressure on China in the very short term to take a stance in the Ukraine conflict and make it clear that they wouldn't support Russia, let alone that they would support Ukraine. I think at this point, the EU is both a bit slower to react than the US in this context, but is also more reluctant to take a stance that would be viewed in China as putting a very direct and very immediate pressure on Chinese policymakers. It's partly a difference in diplomatic culture and strategic culture probably, as well as I mentioned, the sheer inability of taking quick action in that kind of environment. I look very much forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. And just a reminder, please send your questions in. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan Freed.
Deanna, thank you. And my thanks to the Consul General for co-sponsoring, as well as the two centers at the University of Toronto and UBC. I'm one among other Canadians in this discussion, so I'm not going to offer the Canadian view, but a Canadian view. And I look forward to Deanna and Eve's observations as well. Let me say a few things as a Canadian. Number one, although some criticize Canada for being behind the curve, where are we on the Indo-Pacific? I think it's worth reminding ourselves that Canada's been engaged in the entire Indo-Pacific region for well over a century, whether it was the missionaries in the late 1800s, selling wheat to China to help address their famine in the 1960s, our participation in the Korean War in between and as a guarantor ever since. In the era of decolonization, our development assistance has been constant, modest, but constant, with particular emphasis on the poorest, both within and between countries. And of course, as a trading nation, our proactive engagement speaks for itself. The Canada-Korea bilateral free trade agreement, the CPTPP, the launch of negotiations between Canada-ASEAN, exploratory talks with Indonesia, and ongoing discussions that have gone on for many years with India regarding both trade and investment. So it's fair to say that Canada has long been an Indo-Pacific country. And just by the way, of course, we were among the founding members of APEC and a founding member of the Asian Development Bank, whose territory reaches well into Central Asia as well. What's going on and what is referred to in the media, as well as in the speech from the throne and ministerial mandate letters, as they're called, is in effect a fresh look. It is time for Canada to refresh this long-standing engagement. Why? Just as the war in Ukraine underscores that the future of the world depends on peace, stability, and some modicum of growth and prosperity in Europe, you can say the same thing in spades about the Indo-Pacific region. You mentioned the population numbers, the GDP numbers, Deanna. That's a young population. Estimates suggest that 2/3 of the world's middle class will be in the Indo-Pacific region by the end of this decade. If all goes well, these people will be improving their lives, improving their level of income. They will be good customers and remarkably good and well-educated producers. But if we're going to witness that evolution, that depends on certain foundations that are far from certain. It depends on an environment that provides both good political governance, free from discrimination and civil strife, good economic governance that makes doing business possible. We've witnessed toing and froing in various countries in the region, where failure to address one or another stakeholder community can lead to disruption and dampen the prospects for stable growth. Remember red shirts versus yellow shirts in Thailand, the separatist movements in the southern Philippines, and of course, civil war in Myanmar. So we know that exclusion, we know that bad governance, we know that not creating the preconditions for basic human dignity runs both counter to the basic rights of individuals, but also to the kind of peace and stability that we all need in the region and from the region. Climate was mentioned as well. The world depends on this region for the air we breathe. Over 50% of global emissions emanate from the Indo-Pacific. Their success is our success, and similarly, their failure will be a global failure. Tens of millions of people potentially underwater, mass migration, destruction of the possibility of doing sustainable agriculture is at stake unless we address together with the region the climate challenge as well. And then between states, as we see, threats of coercion or the use of force undermines the kind of stability I've talked about. So why a refresh now for Europe, for the United States, and for Canada? Let me identify 2 or 3 things. First, the integration of the region has been absolutely remarkable. The regionalization of supply chains, the production of intermediate goods that flow back and forth, somewhat similar to the way North America has developed, has been remarkable. India, increasingly, to borrow Prime Minister Modi's terminology, is not just looking east, but acting east in the region as well, with a major expatriate population in business present as well. Second reason for taking a fresh look, we know, and some of you have already commented, this is a remarkably heterogeneous regions, countries with very different levels of development, from the most wealthy to among the least developed. Very different models of government throughout the region, varying levels of, shall we say, maturity in democratic governance. So some remain under strain at home, some remain under pressure from bigger partners abroad. And what's interesting when we contrast it with the evolution of Europe or even in the Americas is we haven't seen the parallel evolution alongside the integration of business, any parallel evolution of institutional intergovernmental structures. You don't have common language or religion. You don't have, therefore, overarching regional organizations. You have a bit of a mosaic of different fora for different purposes. And Asia, I think it's fair to say, is contrasted unfavorably to Africa, to the Gulf states, to the Americas in that regard. It was Kissinger who said in the early days of the European project, who do I call when I want to talk to Europe? And there was no answer to that. Same question, who do you call when you want to speak to Asia? There are different partnerships for different purposes that are still in the process of evolution and consolidation, and that requires a fresh look. And third, the development agenda, the sustainable development goals are still in process and require the support of donors and recipients alike. And what Russia-Ukraine reminds us is that whether it's saber rattling, the threat of force, or the potential actual use of force, the foundation, which is where I started, of a rules-based order at peace is fundamental. Russia having called off the peace treaty negotiations on the Northern Islands with Japan, the Pacific Ocean is connected not only to the Antarctic, but to the Arctic as well. And that is now at issue with Russia in the chair, but the Arctic Council suspended in its activities. So all of which is to say there needs to be a community of interest in providing a voice for stability, for a rules-based order, for the foundations for sustainable growth. So that all adds up to bringing an Indo-Pacific lens to bear on what Canada has been doing and what it should be doing for the future. Prime Minister Trudeau has long endorsed a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific with ASEAN as its core, at its core. This is not, in my read, it's not an anti-China or a China containment strategy. nor is it a, quote, me too approach that Canada's trying to catch up with others. It's a fresh, self-interested look, both out of altruism and self-interest, as to what a made in Canada for Canadians and for countries of the region approach might be. That in turn, going back to my architectural point that it's a mix of partnerships, means that Canada is not trying to join the Quad, not trying to catch up with AUKUS, but rather sees variable geometry in the way we can contribute our best value added, and the people we might sit down with on climate might be a different table than who we sit down with on security, and a different table again on who we talk to about economics and trade. Looking ahead, I think what I would hope for and expect from the Canadian government is an approach that encompasses, as you said in your very brief introduction, Deanna, security and intelligence pillar for that foundation of peace and the rule of law, maritime and on land, a robust trade and economic development agenda encompassing trade, investment, infrastructure, and so on, and a continued engagement, a Canadian vocation, on development assistance and the Sustainable Development Goals, with an eye still to gender, to inclusion, and to climate as well. Now, just to wrap up where I started, is Canada behind the curve? Why is it taking so long? Well, frankly, if you look at the Canadian domestic political environment, we went through an election in the early fall. It took a little while to form the cabinet. It took a little while after that for ministers to receive their full mandate of instructions. And of course, ministers need to be briefed and familiarized with the details. Add to that the continuing shock and waves of COVID that have caused disruptions in supply chains, that have made the urgent the enemy of the good a bit, so we could respond, whether with vaccine donations or arrangements for medical equipment and supplies. China-Taiwan tensions rising, that all has interfered. And with Russia-Ukraine, we know that there are looming and very serious supply shortages. Oil and gas getting all the publicity, but the cutoff of potash and nitrates for fertilizer, the cutoff of 30% of the world's wheat and other cereals, not to mention palladium and other minerals for automotive production, is changing the dynamic and changing the economics in a more immediate way for the region. So I'm sure my former colleagues still in government working on this are digesting and working through the significance of all of these changes. And on the institutional side, what does it mean if Russia is at war for convening an APEC meeting, for Indonesia convening a G20 summit, or some of the other bodies we've taken for granted, the defense ministers who get together under what's known as ADMM plus, ASEAN plus 10 other countries, includes Russia. I'm not sure that kind of meeting can take place or be very productive this year. So who to call and how to insert ourselves, no doubt is taking a little more time than some in the public might wish. Conversely, however, although Nicolas highlighted the next 12 to 24 months for Europe, my understanding is that Canada is looking in this refresh and reset of an Indo-Pacific strategy and approach to provide a roadmap for the next 5 to 10 years. Some of the things I've been talking about, be it climate mitigation, remediation, adaptation, be it trade frameworks, be it security arrangements, take time. And in building that foundation of governance for prosperity and for sustainable development, the engagement has to be consistent, persistent, and ongoing. So the amount of time in preparation that's being taken now hopefully will provide the benefits of a sustained engagement going forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And we have some questions coming in. So Eve, I will send it over to you and then we'll get to your question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Deanna, and thank you, colleagues, for those fascinating words. So I'm just going to add a few big picture words and add a couple words as well on ASEAN and India in a comparative framework, but be short. So the Indo-Pacific strategy space is the hot space, essentially. There is a lot going on very fast right now. And for all the countries we're talking about today, the attention has shifted from Asia-Pacific strategies, 10 years ago, or emerging power or emerging market strategies to Indo-Pacific strategies. And this is happening now. On top of it, we're watching, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the terrible events. I think the combination of both things remind us that we are at a historical juncture, and we may see the end of the post-Cold War world, which was the era of markets, global markets, and liberal globalization. We're entering a new phase, and the competition of Indo-Pacific strategies is part of that. When we unpack where Indo-Pacific strategies come from, it's based on a layer of events. I see 7 critical components. First, it started with India. Actually, it's the originator with the India Act East strategy going back to the 1990s. Then the maritime tensions, South China Sea and East China Sea, involving China and its neighbors in the early 2010s. Japan then integrated the combination of continued prosperity in the region and economic integration and security tensions and rule of law tensions into this FOIP concept. So in a way, Japan is the entrepreneur, the policy entrepreneur that kind of brought those things together in 2016, building on earlier steps, as we heard from Akio Fukushima-san. Then we have seen an acceleration of US-China tensions. COVID came in, adding concerns about digital space and supply chains and coercion against Australia and Lithuania by China. Then we saw further securitization linked to a growing threat perception of China, including in the Taiwan space. And then finally, we have Ukraine shock. So all this leads us to this new moment where basically all the countries are adjusting their economic and security strategies. Everything is interactive. And the space of Indo-Pacific strategies, for me, embeds several things. First, it's a new geographic idea. So it's not just now an Asia-Pacific space, but we add the whole, of course, India is the critical player, but all South Asia and to some extent Central Asia. It's important to note here that different countries and regions have different definitions. So for India and Japan, they also include Eastern Africa, but not the US. So there's different boundaries on what the Indo-Pacific space is. Second, the Indo-Pacific space is currently the space for innovation and exploration, advancing multilateral governance on frontier issues like cyber, green technology, pandemic response, trade, at a time when global governance is not providing those answers. So all the partners here are finding or advancing those new areas, seeking solutions that are innovative without going through a global platform. Third, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy space integrates a big change, which is the securitization of the economy and of trade. From World War II, essentially, until recent years, there has been this huge effort to separate global political economy from security. At the moment, they're being reintegrated as we see that there's a lot of security implications to supply chains, to trade, to even green technologies. Fourth, the Indo-Pacific strategy space integrates values. So values are being brought back into trade, into economy. And we start talking about like-minded coalitions of democracies, for example. Fifth, for many, but not all, a core motivation is actually balancing against China that has been seen increasingly as a threat. But different countries are clear or not clear about it. And so that makes it interesting. They sometimes mention it very indirectly, or they don't mention it, or they're very direct about it. 6, there's a lot of speed and velocity. So there's velocity in global events at the moment. We're going through an age of disruption, but there's also lots of interaction among those strategies that react to each other. And it's very, very fast moving. 7, it's a cumulative space. As more players get into this Indo-Pacific strategy space, we find more and more dimensions being brought in, and everybody is adjusting in a Bayesian way, in a way. And then finally, the cumulative effort on the Indo-Pacific strategy is both a reaction to the lack of progress in global governance, but it adds to it. That is, it reduces the attention or the interest in things like G20 or WTO. Now, of course, when it comes to G20 or ASEAN Plus, as mentioned by Jonathan Fried earlier, there's a critical question today about Russia. To me, it seems unthinkable that the other leaders will meet with the Russian leader at the G20 in Indonesia, even if that's the initial Indonesian inclination. I think the others will never accept to it. So we may be moving toward the ASEAN-Myanmar solution, that is where the Russian seat is kept, but where the leader is not invited, in which case Russia may just not show up. So all this is being tested at the moment. Interestingly enough, for India, whom we haven't yet covered very much, it started very early, but the full stipulation of an Indo-Pacific vision took place in June 2018 at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And the vision by India was so-called positive, with 6 elements: inclusivity, ASEAN centrality, rules-based order, equal access to the commons, trade liberalization, and connectivity. And it said that it was not targeting anybody. So there was no China mention. However, in the wake of the border conflicts between India and China in 2020, in May, India stepped up its engagement with the Quad, became much more vocal even on South China Sea disputes, and is working with Japan and Australia to advance supply chain resilience. So there's a lot of effort right now, a lot of changes in India, even from its 2018 stipulation, showing the plasticity and velocity of those strategies. I won't say more about Japan, given how much was covered. ASEAN is worth a few words. ASEAN is at the center. Everyone mentions ASEAN centrality. The first strategy came out in 2019 with a 2021 formulation that's more full, but ASEAN insists on being an honest broker and wants a space of dialogue and cooperation rather than rivalry. The principles are openness, transparency, inclusivity, rules-based framework, good governance, sovereignty, non-intervention, complementarity with existing framework, mutual trust, and like. And so their priorities are connectivity, SDGs, climate, innovation, and fourth industrial revolution. So there's much less emphasis on security in ASEAN, and ASEAN is actually ill at ease with the security focus in many IPS, Indo-Pacific strategies. On the EU, I will just add to what Nicolas said, that the EU in the latest formulation that took place in the fall 2021, the Indo-Pacific strategy, it does mention prosperity, connectivity, democracy, and ASEAN centrality, and it has 7 pillars: sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, ocean governance, digital governance, connectivity, security and defense, and human security. So in conclusion, when we do tables and we compare all the various Indo-Pacific strategies on their mention or not of China, on the space of given to rule of law, the space given to security, or to green tech and climate, to infrastructure, we find actually, or trade especially, we find a lot of differences and variations. So I see this as a very competitive space, the space where lots of new ideas are being developed, lots of new partnerships are being tested. It's a very entrepreneurial moment in a way, a time of creation. And so for Canada, essentially, this is a moment to play actively into this, the space of Indo-Pacific strategies as it's arising, as a chance to develop new partnerships, to deepen some, and to advance the role in supply chain security, or economic security, or climate and green tech, or even the role of government in the economy. All those things are being discussed and tested, but it's there is no very clear unified voice yet that's coming out from all those strategies. Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's so much food for thought here. I don't even know where to start. Eve, perhaps next time we'll have a table like you suggest, because there's so many different types of Indo-Pacific strategies going forward. So we have some questions coming in. So I'm going to take a look at them, but also does anybody want to comment on what anybody else has said? And also some of the questions that have come in incorporate some of the issues that you have all been talking about. So we can talk about nuclear weapons, how what is happening in Ukraine will affect, how does Japan feel about this? For example, the role Taiwan, what is China looking at in terms of Taiwan on that? India, what's going to happen with India in the Quad? There are so many different interesting issues coming up, so I look forward to your comments. Who wants to start?
Well, maybe all angels, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So I hope I'm not going to be too far off base. I think what we've heard from the United States, or an interpretation from Christie of the United States, from Europe, what I said about Canada is there is a common interest, and Eve underscored that the region itself has a common interest in stability and peace. And whether you're talking about Taiwan, the Northern Islands, or any other territorial disputes, and that includes India, Pakistan, Nepal, what you don't want and what nobody should want is a unilateral change in the status quo. And thus the use or threat of use of weaponry, the deployment of force or other forms of coercion is not appropriate and not something that anybody wants in the region. India, just as a footnote, vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, of course, faces the unique challenge of whatever mischief in nuclear terms Pakistan may be up to. It has been somewhat dependent on Russian weaponry for what it would call a defensive stance. So one appreciates that there's a bit of caution there in light of its current relationships. But I don't think its territorial integrity is well served were they to actually welcome or endorse unilateral actions such as what Russia is trying to do with Ukraine or parts of Ukraine. So I'll stop there. I have a few comments on some of the other questions, but you're the conductor, Deanna, so you carry on.
Go ahead, Akiko-san.
Thank you. On possible use of nuclear weapons, there is a growing concern in Japan on a possible nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe. As a matter of fact, in 1999, I visited Pyongyang, North Korea, for academic exchange. And there, North Korean representative told me, preached me, that they have to continue the development of missiles and nuclear weapons because they do not want to emulate the fate of Eastern European nations at the end of the Cold War. They argued, unless you have nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction for that matter, your country would not be able to maintain your regime. Therefore, unless Japan is willing to pay all the cost of those weapons, they have to continue their development. And their logic has been very consistent up until today, as I hear test launches of missiles almost every week this year. And I'm sure Mr. Kim Jong-un is closely watching the situations in the war in Ukraine. And we have to raise our voices not to let this situation develop any further. On the part of Japan, we do not possess nuclear weapons, although there is some discussions in the parliament, or parliamentarians, I should say, about nuclear share. Prime Minister Kishida denied such possibility, and we have to think deep about these problems. And this is not unique to Japan. This is common to the whole globe. Quickly, one word on Taiwan, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
On Taiwan, as all of us have argued, situations in Taiwan and Ukraine are completely different. However, I'm sure China is closely watching how the international community react to the war in Ukraine, how their actions will be reacted by others. For the moment, I do not think China will opt for any military operations vis-a-vis Taiwan. I think they'll go for infiltration. However, we should know clearly that they are watching closely how things would develop in Ukraine. Let me stop there.
Thanks very much. Other comments, please? Eve, then Christy, then Nikolai.
Oh, maybe we should let them speak first. I'll speak
First,
back. Yeah.
Okay, I'll jump in then.
Right.
So just a reflection on all of the comments, I think that we hear in all of the presentations a lot of agreement, a lot of the same lists of issues that are important to discuss across the countries or different entities here. But I think we also hear some very different approaches in a lot of ways. For example, this is probably most clearly seen in the framing of these strategies vis-a-vis China, with the US, for example, framing China as essentially the motivating challenge for a lot of its strategies, and other countries, including Japan and ASEAN, also, emphasizing this inclusivity, that anybody in the region can be part of this. And I think, as much as the US and others would like to see these complementarities, that is still a challenge and a question about how one moves forward. So I think also you see this contrast between shared understandings of problems and then questions about implementation, even in things like supply chains, which have become sort of a buzzword in every national conversation, essentially. But, even among like-minded partners, there's still a lot of questions about how exactly one will achieve supply chain resiliency. And there's certainly the issue of even like-minded partners are competitors in certain economic spaces, so I think that, and then also firms have to play a role in this, and they have various feelings about complying with government policies. So I think that, it's interesting to think about these strategies as laying out issue sets and to see the kinds of coherence across them. But I think they also already, identify their own areas of tension and then beg a lot of questions about implementation that will be interesting to see moving forward.
Can I just jump in here and both for Eve and Jonathan to think about in terms of how Canada, and this is coming up in the questions, how Canada can move together with the US and how Canada is viewed as a partner in Asia. And then I want to come back to Christy at some point to talk about more detail on the economic framework, because I don't think Canada is meant to be a part of it as to what they're thinking about at the moment. They're focusing mostly on Asia. So that's another area where we might want to get involved. But certainly Europe is going to be playing a bigger role in Asia. And so I'd love to hear from Nicola as well. Nicola, are you there?
Oh yeah, sorry, I hadn't realized you were calling on me first.
Yeah.
I think the big question for Europe, of course, is how the war in Ukraine will transform it. And it has already transformed it to a significant extent. The European Union is not a static entity. It is an experiment. It is a work in progress. It has changed a lot over the past 10, 15 years through the Eurozone crisis, through the Brexit episode, of course, and also importantly through COVID-19 with the first major initiative to issue debt and spend money at the EU level in response to the COVID-19 shock, which really was a transformation. I'm not sure how much it was observable from Asia, but a pretty radical transformation of the fiscal and financial architecture of the European Union. So now we have the shock of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and it has prompted an immediate reaction, which frankly was impossible to predict ex ante, of the European Union in terms of asserting its competence in military affairs, and immediately by providing weapons to Ukraine with a mechanism that is initiated at the EU level, 1 billion euros of spending on this program at this point, and probably going to be bigger going forward, but also a dramatic reassessment of the importance of defense spending and military preparedness in what binds Europeans together. So immediate effect, of course, had been the announcement by Germany of dramatically increasing their military spending. But beyond that, there will be a lot of debate, not immediately, but in the medium term, on how to organize defense more effectively at the EU level, because it can no longer be an issue that is set aside, considering the nature of the risk. Now, all this, I think pretty obviously, is dependent on what happens with the war in Ukraine, the possible escalation of the war, and the outcome of the war. And I don't think any of us can predict that at this point. I don't think any of us would have predicted 3+ weeks ago when the war started that the war situation would be where we are now on March 21, and especially the very poor performance of the Russian military, the very good performance of the Ukrainian military. Both have been, and perhaps less importantly, but still importantly, the ability of all G7 countries plus others, but including Japan, the US, UK, EU, Canada, and more, to come together with very dramatic sanctions, especially on the Central Bank of Russia. All this was completely unexpected and has changed the map. So my expectation is that we will see more of those unexpected developments in the very near term, which makes our role as commentators on medium to long-term issues very difficult, because there will be past dependency here.
We have to expect the unexpected. Yves, over to you.
All right, so there's a whole bunch of points here, but very briefly on Canada cooperation with the US over Indo-Pacific strategies. So there's a couple things to say. The big picture is that Canada has to do what it has always done, which is cooperate closely with the US on security. We have integrated security interests on supply chain, that many things where we're deeply integrated, deeply connected in our interests, while also doing a few things on its own where it's Canadian interest, when of course it's not a top red line for the US, right? But one thing to note is the new IPEF that's coming out, and the current thinking on the Indo-Pacific strategy by the US does not include Canada. They're going to offer as Indo-Pacific partners, mostly, they're going to invite partners in the space from India to, well, India is a question even because some dimensions are difficult, but at least in East Asia. And the plan is to not invite Canada, Mexico, Peru, etc. And so Matt Goodman was here in Canada last week at Laval saying, this is the time for Canada to make some noise, right? Otherwise, Canada get excluded. Meanwhile, Canada has one big advantage, which is being a member of the CPTPP. And so that's actually the essential piece of a trade Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's in place. And the core problem is that the US is not in it. Last week, at the end of the week, there was a panel on Southeast Asia toward the Indo-Pacific Strategy done by the Quincy Institute in Washington. And the three speakers from Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all said that, the lack of US presence in the CPTPP means that they will miss out on the essential economic prosperity in Asia, and that nothing can really replace it. No aircraft carrier can replace the lack of a trade involvement. And so Canada has that advantage and could probably do more with it. Meanwhile, the EU had a summit on Indo-Pacific in France, February 22nd, just before the Russian invasion. They invited Canada, but not China and the US. So that's one great advantage for Canada, is to play in many, in a lot of spaces that can give it some value and some competitive advantage when working then together with the US. So that's on the IPS space. On Ukraine, to me, top of my mind is the risks of escalation are probably higher than we even imagined, including nuclear. And I was rereading last night the Black Swan book by Nasib Taleb, right? We always discount this. We have narrative fallacy, but that's where we have to get into psychology. And everything we know about Putin over his 30-year dominant career, 30+ year, is that he always doubled down, he always escalated, and he never lost a bet until now. And the reflex, the pattern has always been doubling down and escalating. He's not taking a no, he's not taking a loss. And so we are facing very, very high risks. And we have to, hopefully the top leaders, and it seems like Biden knows that, have to handle this current moment with a lot of care. And we have to watch for emotions and excitement. On Taiwan, on balance, listening to a lot of specialists, from the US and elsewhere and in the region, I think the median position of most China specialists is that there is no immediate threat, and that China is not even militarily ready, right? It doesn't have, Ukraine is hard, Taiwan is a lot harder because there's the ocean, and it's very easy to harden the target. And so then there is a bit of time, and the key is to use that time to avoid a cycle of acceleration, tit-for-tat acceleration and misunderstanding. The problem is that trust has been eroded. And so there is fear on the Taiwan side and the partners, including Japan, that may lead them to accelerate weaponization or bringing more defense assets, and to which then China can respond. And if that cycle of tit-for-tat gets out of hand, that's when we can have a conflict. So it's again a subtle game of consolidated Taiwan's ability to defend itself while having enough reassurance to not trigger the sequence that we don't want to trigger. India Quad relations, very interesting at the moment, because India indeed is having has a lot of its weapons supplied by Russia. Some say 70%, some say 60%, and so has abstained at the UN along with China. But actually, all of South Asia except Nepal and Bhutan has also abstained. Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka also abstained. So it's something interesting that shows the depths of relationships. On the other side, Cambodia did not abstain. And Cambodia is the closest ASEAN country to China. So that indicates that there was no pressure from China probably on Cambodia, or that Cambodia has enough of an independent streak here. Lots to watch, lots of moving pieces.
Thanks very much. Christy, did you want to add something?
Sure. So Eve already mentioned a lot of the points about the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but for those who may be less familiar, I would mention that the framework is thought to be structured as a collection of individual agreements, and then countries in the region will pick and choose the agreements in which they wish to participate. So there are a lot of questions about what these would look like. And, we mentioned that the pillars are trade, which would include digital trade, trade facilitation, et cetera, supply chains, infrastructure and decarbonization, and tax and anti-corruption. But, in a lot of these areas, if you think about infrastructure, for example, there's clearly a lot going on with connectivity in Europe, and they have a strong interest in that. With supply chains, the conversation is similarly beyond the countries who are in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there are a lot of synergies, and there are a lot of, willingness and need to harmonize these discussions cross-regionally. So I do think that although Canada is not part of this discussion initially, the administration is very concerned about buy-in for this Indo-Pacific economic framework. They really want countries to participate. They want it to be something that has traction. And if it's not, then it really undermines their strategy for engagement. So I do think there's an opportunity here. If there are countries who wish to participate in given issues and have something to bring to the table, then, I do think this is a time when, they are looking for takers. there's sort of room at the table in that sense, even if that's not clear from the beginning. But I think these conversations, for example, about harmonizing discussions within the TTC between the US and Europe and within the Quad, there's all these very similar conversations that are going along, in multiple venues that need to be harmonized. I might just say something quickly on the issue of the US and in terms of its approach to Ukraine versus Asia and this concern perennially of, the US shifting its focus to Europe and ignoring Asia. I do think there are, of course, a lot of concerns. It's a complex situation. The administration, of course, is repeatedly emphasizing that the Indo-Pacific is a long-term strategic priority theater. And in the short term, they've also made the point that the aid and other resources that are going to Ukraine are not being diverted from Asia. They're, separately budgeted. But of course, in the mid to long term, this is a concern because, as others have said, we don't know what will happen with the conflict. And even after the conflict itself ends, there's clearly going to be a whole range of issues that demand US attention for a long period of time. But I think there are a couple of things that mitigate against the US just forgetting about the Indo-Pacific. And one of them, as people have mentioned, is just that the two regions are clearly interlinked and everyone is increasingly aware of that. So what happens in Ukraine has consequences for the Indo-Pacific. They may not be very clear or necessarily completely parallel consequences, but everyone sees this. And I think we've seen this crisis and this conflict really galvanize response in ways that perhaps surprised some observers. And the US is well aware that it needs to be active in both theaters. And then second, I think that the fact that China's support for Russia and closer China-Russia relations have been such a focus of conversation means that the intense focus of the US on China in the Indo-Pacific will just be amplified, if anything, by their concerns about Russia, and it will explicitly connect the two theaters in a way that will mitigate against this shift in focus. So although Russia, for example, is not in the Indo-Pacific strategy, the fact that China is linked to this will keep the focus in the region.
Thanks very much. We have to wrap up, so I'm going to give Jonathan the final word and then we'll ask Consul General to comment. Thank you.
So very quickly, if I can try and integrate a number of the questions and observations into 3 quick points. Number one, without meaning to repeat, the architecture is messy, and thus variable geometry is the name of the game. Canada and the United States, for example, are the closest of partners on critical materials and critical minerals. That's part of the US Indo-Pacific Strategy. It's part of a Canada-US work program. We're going to work, as Eve suggests, hands in glove where we have common interests. I don't think there's any areas where we're at odds with each other, but where there may be other partners at the table. So there's no unifying successor to what used to be called CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization framework in the Cold War. That was a parallel to NATO in the offing. The military and defense and intelligence cooperation will again be Five Eyes Plus or some variation of that theme. Second, Canada brings to the table, notwithstanding some of the implicit criticism in the comments, continuing credibility. As a good founding, early ratifying CPTPP member, as a founder and convener of the Ottawa Group, the Middle Powers, trying to invest in the multilateral system. The Consul General may wish to say a word, but Canada and Japan have a 6-point, very robust work program bilaterally on strategic priorities, and we're a valuable partner to Japan. India has shown a recent shift to embracing more open trade and investment, so our perseverance through 13 or 14 rounds of somewhat stalled negotiations may well pay off. So, as I tried to say, Canada has percolated along. This more robust strategic framework to come, I think, will reinforce much of that. One final word on Taiwan. Canada has announced its intention to explore a foreign investment protection agreement with the territory. China right now, vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, has fundamental, and Nicola, if there's time, I know could elaborate, fundamental interests in being part of the rest of the globe's economic system. Their financial and economic stability and prospects for growth obviously depend on having customers well beyond Russia and its sphere of influence, of having a payment system that it can participate in, of raising money on capital markets. For all those regions, it's going to, I think, continue to tread carefully and try and walk a fine line, not to totally offend their Russian friends on the one hand, but not to do anything to aggravate or invite sanctions that would hurt their economic prospects on the other. So that also means staying quiescent on Taiwan for some time to come as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Storyoji, yoroshiku onegai itashimasu.
Well, thank you everyone for this interesting an hour and a half. And I also thank Professor Lipsy for giving me this one of the most difficult tasks, speaking at the last of this important and many issues already pop up. Well, I'll be brief, but as a practitioner, I was involved in starting of a TPP in 2010 Yokohama APEC, and I didn't expect that TPP will be that kind of economic regional issue or a monster afterwards. And also about the FOIP, as Ambassador Fried referred to the 6 areas Canada and Japan were building on. I was starting the discussion when I was working in Ottawa almost 3 years ago, and that became a big issue at the moment, including this Ukraine. Well, at the time when we're organizing this webinar, everybody thought, oh, everybody forget about FOIP. Now people concentrate on Ukraine and nothing to do with FOIP. But now I think the listener think it's everything. It was very relevant to our region as well. Well, people little note that there is a report on Japanese media that a week ago, 6 vessels of Russian Navy departed from Vladivostok, passing the Tsugaru Kaikyo, Tsugaru Strait. Nobody knows where they're heading for, but maybe to the Black Sea to supply or reinforce their forces over there. So everything is linked. Everything is unpredictable. So you have to open our eyes and watch carefully. On Japan, Canada, many things already discussed, but I want to point out 2 things as a practitioner again. One, Justin Trudeau visited Japan at the occasion of G7 and G20, but not yet as a bilateral visiting. Number 2, Japanese defense minister never visited Canada for the past 30 years. The last one is 1990, when Ikeda Yukihiko-san was the chief of defense agency. Lastly, this is my personal view. One big piece missing in the discussion internationally about Ukraine and others, which is United Nations or international existing system. People think about well, Russia is a permanent member, so Security Council is nothing, General Assembly is nothing. But all know that what happened in 1956, when the Suez Canal was in crisis, the direct involvement was UK and France, where Egypt and US intervened. And at that time, the Canadian foreign minister, together with Secretary General of the United Nations, created the first time peacekeeper from the United Nations. And I'm sure after these Ukraine and destruction and everything, International Court of Justice or rule of law will come back again. You have to rebuild. You have to compensate. You have to who was bad and what happened in the past. You remember even the United States and Iran had a hostage case. They set up a tribunal to compensate everything. And most of the cases was resolved under the rule of law. So that is my personal observations. And time is exactly 20:30. And thank you so much again for everyone. I'm looking forward to see you again soon. Thank you. Back to you, Diane.
Thanks very much, everybody. It was great having a chat on this very important topic. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.